I've been living in my house for about 3 weeks now. I was not planning on being a homeowner this soon in my life, but when this house went up for sale, it was an absolute steal, so I decided to buy it. In an attempt to make the house feel more like my own, I decided to renovate some parts of the building, starting with the floor. I thought it best to start in the basement of the house and begin to rip up the ugly green carpet that the previous homeowner had left. I was nearly done getting rid of the carpet and was pulling the last bit of the covering off the ground when I uncovered the trap door. Underneath the green carpet was a plain cement floor, and in the center of the room there was a thick slab cut into the concrete. The handle was flush with the rest of the floor, so there was no way of knowing that it was under the carpet. The owner never mentioned the trapdoor to me, and I began to wonder if he even knew that it existed. I grabbed the handle of the concrete slab and lifted it with all my might. The heavy door did not open easily, but once it was off, I saw a ladder leading down that disappeared into the darkness below. I went through the boxes that I packed for the move and found the big industrial flashlight that I keep for emergencies. I shined the light down the hole and saw that the bottom was 100 feet below me and seemed to open up into a large room. I was hesitant at first, not wanting to end up trapped inside of a room below my basement, but I wasn't one to pass up a good adventure. So I decided to descend the ladder cautiously, making sure that I didn't fall the 100 feet to my death. As I got closer to the bottom of the hole, the air became colder and started to develop a musky scent to it, like the pungent smell of mildew. The ladder didn't reach the whole way to the bottom, leaving about a 4-foot gap between the floor and its last rung. So I jumped down onto the floor below, where I saw just how big the room was. It was enormous. My industrial flashlight didn't even reach the far end of the wall. I could see the walls to the left and right of me, but there was a chasm of darkness ahead of where the ladder was. The walls down there looked damp and were covered in what I expected to be mold, giving the air a very unique odor that left a bad taste in my mouth. I couldn't tell how far the room stretched in front of me, but I didn't want to go exploring it just yet. I didn't think anyone would believe what I found beneath my basement, so I took out my phone and started to record what I was seeing. I was holding the phone with my right hand and was gripping the flashlight with the other. I looked up the ladder, reassuring myself that the trapdoor was still open, and began to walk forward. I kept checking over my shoulder every couple seconds impulsively, and saw the slightly lit up ladder get further and further away from me as I moved deeper into the room. I kept advancing into the unknown, 10 feet, then 20, 50, 100, 200. Then I stopped. I hadn't reached the other end of the room yet, but I saw that there was a large hallway that cut perpendicularly through the room I was in, leaving 2 big openings on the walls to either side of me. I was still about 50 feet from the 2 openings, but I didn't want to advance any closer. I was done exploring for the day. Ever since I entered the room, I felt like I wasn't alone, and I was being watched. But now, standing in front of those 2 entrances, I knew for certain that there was something else down there with me. I was still holding my phone in my right hand and went to stop the video that I was recording when I heard a loud crash behind me. The sudden noise startled me, and I fumbled my phone around, nearly dropping it. I turned around to find that the light shining down from the ladder had disappeared. The trap door must have fallen closed. I turned back to the two entrances and almost screamed. Something was peeking its head out from behind the entrance on the left wall. Whatever it was, I could tell it wasn't human. It had a small, bald head with long, pointy ears and two gigantic, bulging eyes that stuck out from its head with small black pupils surrounded by its bright white corneas. It ducked its head back into the entrance as quick as a rabbit. I just stood there, paralyzed with fear, shining the light at the entrance in the wall, holding my phone, recording everything. Then, all at once, it slowly began to emerge from behind the wall. Its skin was a sickly pink color, and it walked in such an unnatural way, jerking its body about in weird, spastic movements. It was tall, very tall, but its limbs were so skinny. They were just bone covered in loose, flabby skin. It didn't have a mouth, but I could hear its breathing, heavy and slow. I took a step backwards, away from the approaching creature, and that's when it charged me, running with a speed that I didn't think it was capable of, moving around with its unnatural, jerky movements. I threw my phone at it instinctively and then bolted in the other direction. I could hear the creature right behind me as I made my way towards the ladder. The flashlight was jumping all over the place, making it hard for me to see where I was going. But I could just make out the approaching ladder. I jumped up and started climbing up as quickly as possible. I let go of the flashlight. It was slowing me down. I heard it crack as it hit the floor below me, causing everything to go black. I kept climbing, not daring to look down at the creature hot on my trail. I got up and ran out of the basement, not stopping until I got to my neighbor's house. I started slamming on their door, begging them to let me in and call the cops. The police showed up shortly after, along with an ambulance for my now bleeding head. The police investigated my basement and reported that they found the trapdoor open, even though I told them that I had closed it. They also told me that they didn't find a room at the bottom of the ladder. It was just a 100-foot drop that led to nowhere. The paramedics diagnosed me with a pretty severe concussion, which is what they used to explain my bizarre story. But I know what I saw. I know that there was a room below that door. I know that I saw that creature down there with me. And I know that it escaped. I was 15 when we moved to Mayberry. It was a tiny little town, barely 200 souls all told, and my father was their new policeman. Their last one had died, fallen asleep on his desk and never woken up. Father joked that he'd died of boredom, because practically nothing ever happened there. The most exciting crime that had ever happened in Mayberry was a farmer getting drunk and walking into the ladies' book club without his trousers. Mother still giggles when Father tells that story to his colleagues. I'm rather sick of it now. I was raised a good Christian girl, so naturally, I was at the tiny church, right on time for services on Sunday. There were a few whispers behind my back. Locals, not sure what to make of a big city girl in their congregation. Soon enough, though, they welcomed me as a good Christians should. There were a few whispers behind my back. Locals, not sure what to make of a big city girl in their congregation. Soon enough, though, they welcomed me as good Christians should. I fit in far better in Mayberry than I did in the city. Hobbies that had been seen as old-fashioned or not feminist in the city, as if it was some kind of crime to enjoy cooking and making clothing, were good and proper in town. My parents were often surprised when they were congratulated for raising such a well-mannered young lady. I was invited to the book club, to the knitting circle, to the quilting club. I was always the youngest there, but I finally felt like I had found my people in those lovely old ladies. I still count those first months in Mayberry as the happiest of my life. I met Mrs. Brown at the knitting circle. She was a small woman, mousy and timid, who spoke little and who flinched at every loud noise. She was a genius. She was a genius with needles and wool, though, and loved to help others when they were having trouble with their own projects. She was constantly dark under the eyes, and the other ladies would often worry about how tired she always was. She missed meetings quite frequently, and her absences were always met with a sad shake of the head and mutterings about how hard things must have been for her at home. That was how I first heard of the story of the demon. A year before I was born, Mrs. Brown got pregnant. This was good news for her and her husband, as they had been trying for quite some time and were desperate to start a family. The pregnancy was hard, but to hear the ladies of the knitting circle tell it, she practically glowed with joy, even when morning sickness had her so sick she could barely eat or drink. When their son was born, Mr. Brown was so happy that he practically ran through the streets. Mr. Brown was so happy that he practically ran through the streets. He had been so hopeful for a son, and here was a healthy baby boy, just when they were starting to think that there might never be a child. He spent money they didn't really have, buying cigars for everyone who worked at the post office with him, and for the men in the garage, in the publican at the pub. Well, I'm sure you understand. Their happiness didn't last long, though. After a few months, it became obvious that while their son was healthy physically, there was something wrong. Even before his teeth started coming in, he tried to bite anyone who touched him. He screamed and cried all day and night. He lashed out randomly. He only got worse when he started to walk. It came to a head when he was 5 and somehow managed to kill his aunt while visiting family in the city. His parents swept him back to Mayberry in a panic and called the priest. The priest tried to exorcise him, but failed. In the end, they locked their son away in their home and did their best to pretend that everything was totally fine. Naturally, I was told to never mention this story to my parents. I was told to forget that I'd ever heard it and let the Browns live with what little peace they could scrape together. I didn't. I know it's rather arrogant, but I am a seriously good cook and have been for a long time. So when Mrs. Brown missed another get-together, I cooked my best casserole. Lamb and vegetables, thick with gravy and covered with sweet potato, and took it over to her home. She had obviously been crying just before answering the door, but when she saw the food, her eyes lit up and she hugged me. She didn't invite me in that first time, but it was easy to keep doing it. Roasts, casseroles, salads, and sauces, all of my best and favorite recipes. They were fun to make, and my parents were so proud of me for helping. Mrs. Brown started inviting me in the third time for tea and talk. Mr. Brown was gone more and more, getting drunk after work and not coming home for hours. He was always angry, and he was becoming emotionally abusive. He wanted to leave for the city, get a job somewhere newer and louder and brighter, where he didn't have to endure the constant whispers and pity of a small town that knew his secrets. I didn't entirely blame him. but taking it out on Mrs. Brown made me hate him long before I actually met him. He was a coarse man the day he finally came home before dark. Eyes bloodshot and face reddened from drinking. He was perfectly polite to me, if somewhat slurringly, but the way Mrs. Brown suddenly turned from a timid, if sweet woman into a speechless servant put paid to any chance he had of convincing me he was a good man. As I left, I heard his voice rise into a shout, and someone under the house started crying so loudly it was like a howl. I waited until I knew Mrs. Brown would be out of the house. It wasn't hard. She had shown me where she hid a spare key just 2 days before. She and her husband were visiting a family in the city, and she wanted me to water her plants. I wanted to meet the demon to see if the stories were true. The basement wasn't locked, and as soon as I opened the door, I saw why. The so-called demon was chained down, neck and wrist and ankles, to thick metal hoops embedded in a slab of concrete. He was unhealthily thin and ghostly pale, with matted dark hair cut raggedly by someone who obviously hadn't wanted to get too close. His eyes were dark, and there was something about them that made me wonder just what he'd done to his aunt. He made a pathetic mewling sound and cringed away. With the light behind me, he must have mistaken me for Mrs. Brown. We were about the same size back then. I moved closer, slowly and carefully, and crouched down so we were face to face. Eventually, he shuffled forward as far as the chains would let him and leaned in my direction with an expression like a puppy begging for attention. I gently patted his hair, and in that moment, I had his loyalty for life. He begged me not to leave when the sun started to go down, but I had to go. I was raised a good Christian girl, but I had stopped being one a long time before we moved to Mayberry. There are books, if you manage to be lucky enough to look in the right place, and people who will talk in exchange for knowledge and favors. I knew how to identify a demon before I met Benny. I knew how to win their loyalty. With him, it was exceptionally easy. A demon born of a human woman craves human affection above all else. And the Browns starved him as efficiently as if they'd stopped feeding him. Locked up alone in the dark, fed the bare minimum and constantly held down with blessed cold iron. I couldn't have asked for a more perfect opportunity. I copied the key and put it back where I found it. I visited him when I could and continued the pretense with his parents. My parents became worried as I suddenly became withdrawn and fretful. Even more so when I started to tell them something and then stopped and said I couldn't. I planned. When I found out that Mrs. Brown was starting to sneak drinks from her husband's stash to cope, I knew my time had come. There were a great many plants that are deeply poisonous in the bush, and so many lovely ladies willing to teach me how to properly steep and infuse teas and tisanes. It was a pity Mrs. Brown woke up while I was cutting up the bodies, but I made sure she died quickly. Far, far more quickly than Mr. Brown. I don't like people who hurt their other half. They never did find the remains. I made sure of that. Several farmers' dogs were quite happy to dispose of the evidence for me. I pretended that nothing had happened, worried with the knitting circle when Mrs. Brown didn't appear, asked her neighbors if they'd seen her when I went to deliver my traditional meal, Sure enough, someone called my father. The news was all over town within the hour. When he found the blood-stained bed sheets and the abused son chained in the basement, Father came to me, asking why Benny was screaming for me when they broke him out. I wept while I spun my story, that I'd found him when watering the plants and hadn't known what to do. Mrs. Brown had always been so nice to me. The social worker from the city couldn't get him into the car. He only wanted to be with me. My parents couldn't say no, not when he looked at them with his sad, dark eyes and begged, tears running down his face. Mayberry was never really the same after that. We moved back to the city not long after. Father completely disillusioned with the policing and sickened by what the Browns had done. Mother was happy to return to the city and her friends. The last I heard, the town was almost empty, too small to be on any maps. As for Benny and I, we're married, in a courthouse naturally, and happy. He loves me for saving him, and I love him for needing me to pretend that he's human. I love the power he gives me. His uncle tried to stop the wedding. So sad that he disappeared afterwards. But our dogs loved the fresh meat. Some kids dream of being an astronaut. Some kids dream of being a police officer. I dreamed of working at my local grocery store. I know, seems weird, but let me explain. My mom and I were on our own. She worked a lot to make up for living on one salary, and we didn't get a ton of quality time together. I used to love our trips to the grocery store. We would choose new things to cook at home and get different snacks every week. My mother was very big on me knowing how to cook and feed myself a variety of things. She didn't want me to end up like one of those girls, the kind that can't even cook an egg. I loved to be in the kitchen. I loved preparing food for people, even if it was just me and my mom. Anyways, aside from the obvious good feelings I got from being in the grocery store, I also loved the staff at the store we regularly went to. They were always friendly and kind. We always got the extra coupons they had at the register, and one of the bag boys would always help us to the car with our groceries. I wanted to give back, be a part of someone else's experience at the grocery store. It may seem small, but it was those little daily moments that contributed a lot to my childhood. When I turned 16, I applied right away. I still remember walking into the store that day. It felt different. I had to make a good impression. The manager that interviewed me had seen me in the store many times and was very gracious with me. I had no work experience and was very excited to learn. I started part-time, and over the years, that evolved into full-time. My first job as a bagger at the grocery line led me to a prestigious position as a shift supervisor in produce. I really loved this place, and among the childhood memories I had grown here, my two best friends now worked with me here at the store. It was like a second home to me. It was a relatively quiet job, as you can imagine. We didn't frequently have a ton of commotion at the grocery store. Every once in a while, there would be a teen trying to purchase alcohol, or a child throwing a tantrum, but that's really as serious as it got around here. This weekend, we were having a farmer's market event in our produce section. There were huge discounts on fresh produce, and even some local produce vendors in the store to offer in seasonal fruit. We rearranged the setup to show more product and placed handmade banners around the produce section. I put a lot of work into making it look very welcoming and fun. Now, in my time with the store, over the last 4 years, I've come to know our regulars. Ray and Liz, my best friends, like to nickname them by their most memorable traits. For example, my favorite elderly lady, Edna, lived on her own and always spoke of how she wished her son visited more. She always asked me for strawberries from the back. She would say, "I want the freshest ones you got. Right out of the ground if you can." They called her strawberries. Just to give you some insight, there isn't usually any produce stored in the back, unless we have no floor space for some reason. It's not a huge store, and produce being perishable, typically all goes to the floor right away. I was excited to be working our little farmers market event with both Ray and Liz, as they always made my shifts more enjoyable. "How much time did you spend on these banners, Scar?" Ray looked baffled. "I wanted them to look nice," I blushed. "Ray, you know how artsy our little scarlet letter is," Liz laughed. "You know I hate that nickname. Ever since we had to read that novel in high school, they have been affectionately calling me Scarlet Letter." "Quit your pouting. Strawberries is here," Ray whispered. I looked into the distance of the store to see Edna entering, and surprisingly, she was accompanied by a very attractive man. "Good morning, Edna," I beamed. "Scarlet, dear, meet my son." She put her arm out towards the man beside her. "This is James," she said with the sweetest smile. He was tall, very tall, maybe 6'5". He had dirty blonde hair and deep green eyes, built like a lumberjack with the 5 o'clock shadow to prove it. "You can call me Jim." He extended a calloused hand. "Scarlet," I blushed. "Scar, where do you want the strawberries?" Liz yelled. "Please, excuse me. Enjoy your visit," I ducked. "Please excuse me. Enjoy your visit." I ducked away. Damn, Edna's son was beautiful. I walked blissfully back over to where Liz and Ray waited. We continued to set out the different stations with fruits and vegetables until everything was done. I took a step back to snap a photo of the display for our store's Facebook page. My store manager caught me then, and we discussed how this might be a great idea to make a monthly event to drive local business. I'd only had my back turned for 15 minutes when I heard the scream. I spun around to see Edna falling and a trail of blood leading back to Jim. I was frozen. There have been many times in my life that I pondered what I might do in a scenario like this, and my conclusion was always brave, but I couldn't move. My chest tightened, and I swear it was silent for an eternity until I realized it was my ears ringing. The horror set in deeper when the ringing faded to screams. The beautiful man who Edna had entered with now stood over her in a pool of her blood. I frantically tried to connect what had hurt her, but I only saw blood on Jim's hands. Like someone was hitting the pause button, I regained control of my body and began to move. I ducked behind the floral counter on the other side of the market display and began to weigh my options. I started tearing at my pockets and apron, but quickly realized I must have dropped my phone in the excitement. I gently peered around the corner to catch a glimpse of my cell phone. Face down near the exit, I took a moment to decide if it would be too dangerous to go after it when I heard the gunshot. More screams. The tears came involuntarily. I needed to do something. There had to be a way to protect these people. There was a landline behind the meat counter. If I could get over there, then I could call 911. I had to be careful, and I had to be fast. I thought it would be possible to move quickly because of the hysteria, but all of a sudden, it was quiet. Too quiet. I crept to the other side of the corner and began to lean out to have a look when it happened. The electricity went out, the only light spilling in at the entrance and quickly fading. It was impossible to see much. There were a few emergency lights that kicked on in the back of the store, but there was barely anyone visible. More screaming, and another gunshot. I tried not to occupy the thought that it might be one of my friends. I hadn't remembered where they had been standing before this hell broke out. I dropped into a crouch and used the darkness to my advantage. I made my way by memory towards the aisles to get to the back of the store. I almost immediately regretted it. As I started moving, I could feel liquid under my feet. I had thought there was a lot more distance between Jim and I, but the distinct smell of blood told me otherwise. I barely made it to the end cap on the aisle before I heard him reloading. I crawled behind some large stuffed animals that were on display for Valentine's Day and tried to steady myself. I had never been so uncomfortable surrounded by giant stuffed bears. I struggled to see, but made out a body dragging itself towards me. It was my manager, and as she got closer, I reached out to pull her into cover with me, but her body was violently ripped upwards. The sound of flesh ripping. I bet you can't imagine that sound. It's as horrible as you think, like the sound of separating chicken breasts multiplied by 100. I saw her legs dangling in the air above my head and noticed the gunshot wound in her calf. Jim wasn't shooting to kill. He was shooting them to slow them down. I choked back vomit as he tore apart her flesh and delightfully ate it. I needed to get away from this. I quietly gathered my courage, and just as I was about to move, one of the oversized teddy bears fell over. I was mortified. Jim dropped the carcass of my manager and began to peer down the aisle I was about to make a break for. I struggled to see his expression, but I could hear him breathing heavily, like he was annoyed his meal had been interrupted. I held my breath and tried to remain still. As he walked closer, I could see more of his blood-stained face. "Scar, are you there?" I watched Jim's mouth open, but it was Ray's voice. What the fuck was this guy? I kept still. It sounded like someone made a break for the door, and Jim was instantly moving to get them. As soon as he turned, I booked it down the aisle, trying to ignore the gunshots behind me. Now was not the time to break down. I had to make it to that phone. I cleared the end of the aisle and stepped behind the end cap. I felt a small wave of relief. To my knowledge, the majority of people in the store had been towards the front for the farmer's market event. I let out a deep breath, savoring the small victory of making it back to the store. It was short-lived. The store roared to life, and the lights almost blinded me. I had been so adjusted to the dark that I couldn't keep my eyes open. I blinked violently and rubbed my eyes with my hands. There were body parts littering the floor beneath my feet, and as if the sight granted the rest of my senses, I immediately smelled it. "Scarlet, dear, I need some of the fresh strawberries from the back." It was Edna's voice, but I knew it couldn't be her. I started to shake. I needed to move, and the light made it more difficult. I mustered what courage I could and made a break for it, slipping between the transparent plastic door that led behind the meat counter. I ducked down, and I was immediately met with a bloated pair of eyes. The butcher sat on the ground next to me with his intestines pulled through his mouth. I covered my mouth with my hands and backed against the opposite wall. My ability to think clearly was vanishing quickly. I could see the phone just a few feet away. "Scarlet, dear," Edna's voice again. "Scar, don't leave strawberries hanging," Ray's voice. "Scarlet, my love, where have you gone?" That was my mother's voice. I dashed over to the phone, hanging on the wall, and grabbed it furiously. I quickly dialed 911 and held it to my ear. There was no ringing, no dial tone, nothing. I looked down frantically to see the cord hanging in 2 pieces. "Scar, what are you doing behind the meat counter?" An amused Ray looked at me. "Ray, what are you doing? Get down!" I whispered while frantically checking our surroundings. She smiled then. Something was wrong with it. She started to laugh, and blood splattered out of her mouth. She was practically hysterical and spewing blood all over the glass casing. I stood in horror, watching my best friend have a laughing fit. The power went out again, and when the emergency light flicked on, Ray was nowhere in sight. I was sobbing involuntarily. I didn't know how much more of this I could take. I felt like I was the only person left in the store, and I just wanted out. I decided to just make a break for the front door. I crept back out to the floor and made my way towards the bakery, which led straight to produce. I was just going to duck behind the displays of baked goods until I made it back to the front. Easy enough. I cleared the baked goods with relative ease and hurried behind one of the carts for the farmer's market. A familiar purse laid on the ground. A familiar purse lay on the ground with its contents spilled out. It was Edna's. I noticed her wallet was laying open, and a few photos were spilling out. Photos of her and a younger gentleman. Writing on the back of the photos said James and Edna, Mother's Day, 2016. It was hard to make out each detail in the dark, but this was definitely not the Jim that was in the store with us. I heard a familiar voice then. "Scarlet, baby, where are you?" It was my mother. No, this wasn't real. I couldn't take it. I dropped the contents of Edna's wallet and booked it. It wasn't far now from the entrance. I passed the floral counter and could see the exit. Someone emerged from the floral counter. My mother. "Scarlet, honey, what are you doing?" She smiled. "Mom, we have to get out of here. What is wrong with you?" I screamed. "He will explain everything, sweetheart. Your father will tell you what's going on." She turned with open arms. Jim came around the corner then. I was horrified. He was dragging Liz's body and chewing on a chunk of her flesh. He carried her by her leg like a doll. Jim handed a chunk of Liz's leg to my mother, and she laughed and took a bite. My mother was gone. I sprinted towards the door, grabbing my phone from the floor on the way out, and landed on my ass outside. It was still bright out. I sprinted towards my car and found that my keys were still in my apron. I had wanted to look back to see if they were following me when my phone started to ring. The caller ID showed it was my mother. I hesitantly answered it. "Mom?" "Scarlet, dear, I'm looking for some fresh strawberries." It was Edna's voice again. I hung up and drove in silence for a while. I know it probably wasn't the best choice, but I decided on home. I was going to need some things after all. I pulled into the driveway to see a dark house. My mother's car was gone. I ran inside and straight to my room and started shoving things in my floral patterned duffel. Phone charger, clothes, the shoebox I had been saving money in. My phone started to ring again. "Mom," the caller ID read. I have never been so terrified to see her photo pop up. I ignored it and zipped up my duffel. I scanned the room one more time and reached for the door handle when I heard it. There was a knock at the door. I stood frozen in my doorway. The only sound was my heart wildly beating. "Scarlet, honey, can you get the door? It should be your father." I started to back away from my door. I had never been a rebellious kid, but I was, in this moment, very glad that I had a bedroom on the first floor. I stood on my bed and slid the window open, slipping outside. I've been driving ever since, only taking short breaks to get gas or eat. I'm starting to get tired, but my mom keeps calling, and I'm terrified that they will find me. I don't know where is safe. I think I'm going to try and take a nap in my car. I just needed to get this down. I needed someone to know I am on my own. I refuse to go to sleep now, for fear of it watching me. I've told myself time and time again that it's not real, but I know what I see is there. Every single time I shut my eyes to dream, I wake up mere seconds later in a cold sweat, unable to move, paralyzed. I'm not just paralyzed by fear. I literally cannot move a muscle. It's like my brain just shuts me out, like I'm being held prisoner. That's when it comes. A shadow in the distance. When it first started happening, I thought it was just the lamp's shadow. However, when the shadow started to twist and tort, I knew it was no lamp. It started to move closer and closer to me, until the shadow literally came off the wall and took solid form. A black shape, unlike anything I could even imagine, stood over me, waiting. Every night I try to scream, but still, I have no control over my body. No sounds come out of my mouth. I try to run, but my legs are stone. Every part of my being is screaming for me to do something, but I can't. I can't do anything but lie there and watch it move closer and closer to me. I am terrified, more terrified than I've ever been. It says nothing, and it does nothing. That thing just hovers, waiting, never moving for what seems like hours. Eventually, I regain control of my body, but as soon as I do, it disappears. There's no trace of it. All that's left is the cold stillness of the night. And I breathe a sigh of relief, and immediately turn on the lights. Then I just sit there, on my bed, shaking from the experience. I expected for it to get better, for me to get used to its presence. But it just gets worse and worse every single night. I tried once to sleep with the lights on, hoping that it wouldn't show, but I was wrong. It was still there, its pitch black body sharply contrasting with the bright room. It was so terrifying that I decided to never attempt that again. This has happened every night for the last 2 months. I try desperately to stay awake, but it won't work. Sleep is inevitable, and so is that thing. Paranoia is starting to control my life. Every second of every day, I feel like something is there, trailing behind me, waiting for me to find it. I need help, but I don't know where to go, who to talk to, or even what to say. There's just no explanation of what's happening to me. I think I'm crazy. Actually, I hope I'm crazy, because the alternative is worse. Sleep isn't even the thing I fear now. What I fear is what happened yesterday. I was at work, sitting at my desk in my cubicle, when the strangest thing happened. I could have sworn that my lamp's shadow moved. As a child, I was a picky eater, like I assume most children are. As my parents tell it, my eating habits transcended normal childhood proclamations of, "I don't like broccoli," and evolved into a refusal to eat absolutely anything of substance. Things other children might eat and enjoy, like chicken nuggets, spaghetti, or even a hot dog, were shunned by toddler me. It got to the point, they say, where they and my pediatrician became concerned for. I stopped growing properly, falling well below the typical percentiles for children's height and weight, and the rest of my development seemed stunted as a result. Phrases were tossed around like failure to thrive and tube feed. In the end, my parents were forced to feed me calorie-loaded milkshakes, made with nutrient-enriched formula every night in a bid to get me to gain weight. Honestly, I don't know how they put up with it. I sounded like I was a little shit. The milkshake regimen extended past toddlerhood and into my childhood. At 5 years old, I was still refusing to eat food, despite the countless nights my parents sent me to bed hungry for refusing to even try my dinner. I was still small for my age, and spent more than a little time in the hospital due to the starvation of my body. My parents would later tell me that they were sure I would be taken away by the state because of how emaciated I appeared. Thankfully, they were in constant contact with doctors who monitored the situation, so there was undeniable proof that my case wasn't due to neglect. At 6 years old, when I should have been starting school, I was still a small kid. My body never received enough nutrients to properly grow, despite my forced feedings, and as a result, my speech and physical movements were stunted, leaving me a 6-year-old that behaved more like a 3-year-old. Again, I don't know how my parents coped. I can remember the day I discovered a food I actually liked. It was September 22nd, 1997. I was at the grocery store with my mother, sitting in the child seat of the cart because my frail legs couldn't handle walking for too long. Mother looked tired and weary, and I could remember staring at the deep lines that seemed etched in her face as she pushed the cart silently through the small store in an attempt to find something, anything that could tempt me to eat. And then I saw it, a jar of jam. I'd tried jam before and hated it. The texture, the stickiness, the overwhelming sweetness. Vile. But this jar, it seemed different to my 6-year-old mind. I pointed it out to my mother. My bony finger extended to the glass jar with the plain white label that read, "Mrs. Wilson's homemade jam." "What, sweetie? What do you see?" My mother's voice was almost as weary as her face as her eyes followed my outstretched hand. When her gaze landed on the jar, her head snapped back towards me like it was elasticated. "You want that, Marky?" The excitement in her voice was barely contained. "You want to try that?" I nodded my head. My mother grabbed the jar of jam off the shelf faster than I'd ever seen her move before. She even smiled. I couldn't remember the last time I saw her do that. We paid for the jam and left the store without so much as bothering to shop for the rest of our groceries. Mother hurried me out to the car, excitedly strapping me into the seat before placing the jar of jam in the front, almost reverently. This was the first time I was actually showing interest in food. She was thrilled. The town I grew up in was small, populated by a mere 350 people. The drive from the grocery store to my house took under 5 minutes. Really, we could have walked if I wasn't so frail. When we got home, Mother excitedly ushered me into the house with the jar of jam clenched tightly in her hand. Immediately, she sat me at the table, as if she were afraid I'd suddenly change my mind and refuse to try what I'd picked out. But my mind and gaze were focused on that jar. It didn't look like the other jams I had tried. It didn't seem lumpy or thick, and there were no seeds. Something about it intrigued my dull little mind, though I can't explain what it was even now. Here, Marky, you want to try this? My mother held out a spoon laden with jam. It was a deep red and seemed to glisten under the kitchen lighting. I remember taking the spoon carefully and raising it to my face, peering at it closely. Anxiously, my mother waited. Slowly, my tongue darted out to taste it. I can't even describe to you what that first taste was like. Imagine the most amazing thing you've ever eaten, coupled with the most euphoric you've ever felt, and that would get you close to what the experience of tasting that jam was for me. I ate everything off the spoon in seconds and silently asked for more. My mother, with tears in her eyes, handed me another spoonful, which I lapped up eagerly. After the 5th spoonful, my mother was openly sobbing and dashing for the phone to call my father and tell him the wonderful news. Meanwhile, I remained entranced by the jam. As a child, I wouldn't have been able to describe the taste to you, my palate being as limited as it was. But as an adult, I can tell you that it's a deep, rich flavor, a combination of sweet and savory that was perfectly balanced. It didn't taste like strawberries or raspberries, but a combination of the two, mixed with some sort of saltiness that seemed to heighten it. I suppose it's a lot like how some people like salted caramel. The combination of sweet and salty. It was bliss. My father stopped by the grocery store on his way home from work and bought another jar. And so, for the next 2 weeks, that became the only thing that I ate. I would have jam for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, followed by my enhanced milkshakes in the evening. My parents were thrilled. They hoped that my sudden liking of this food would lead to me liking other foods too. Then, one day, my mother and I went to the grocery store to buy more of the jam. We found the spot on the shelf where it usually sat empty. Mother, slightly panicked, rushed to the front of the store to ask the clerk if they had any more of Mrs. Willison's homemade jam. Sorry, we're all out right now. My mother's face fell, and she threw a worried glance in my direction. When will you get more? The clerk scratched his beard thoughtfully. Well, see, it's actually made by a local lady, Mrs. Willison. She sold it to Hector to resell in the store. She said she only had so many jars available. No one else seems to like it but your boy there. I was beginning to grow irritable from being in the cart, and not having made my jam. I was beginning to grow irritable from being in the cart and not having had my jam for lunch. My fussing drew Mother's attention, and she stared at me worriedly. "Is there any way I could get Mrs. Willison's address or phone number? That jam is the only thing Mark will eat." Like is common in most small towns, everyone knows the business of everyone else, so the clerk was aware of my parents' struggles in getting me to eat. He must have felt sympathetic towards my mother's sudden stress, because he searched in the back office for the invoice that held Mrs. Willison's address. That afternoon, Mother and I sought out the elusive jam maker. She lived in a cottage on the outskirts of town in a gingerbread-style house that would be described as idyllic nowadays. When Mother knocked on the door, a young woman answered. She was small, with blonde hair in a tight bun and a sad face. "Can I help you?" Her voice was soft, and years later, Mother would tell me that there was something about Mrs. Willison that was so dejected and forlorn. But desperation is a wonderful motivator, and my mother wanted me to keep eating. So she pasted on a smile and explained the situation to the young woman at the door. "Oh, that is so wonderful," Mrs. Willison exclaimed, smiling for the first time since she came to the door. "I am so happy he likes it. It's an old family recipe, and when Hector said it wasn't selling well, I thought maybe I messed up the batch." My mother asked if Mrs. Willison had any more jam, and with a smile, the woman retreated into her house and returned a moment later with a box. "This is the last of it. I've kept a few jars myself, but since it seemed so unpopular, I didn't think I was going to make another batch." "This is amazing," my mother said, seeming to sag under the weight of the box and the relief she felt. "I don't know what it is about this jam that he loves so much." Mrs. Wilson laughed. "I'm just glad I didn't mess it up like I was thinking I had." My mother offered to pay the other woman, but she refused, saying that seeing someone enjoy her creation was payment enough. We left with a dozen jars. We managed to stretch those out for several months, though I hated having to ration my precious confection. One day, a few weeks after I turned 7, we saw Mrs. Willison in town. She waved a cheery greeting to my mother and waddled her way over, her round, protruding stomach making her slightly off balance. "Congratulations," my mother exclaimed when they drew nearer. Mrs. Willison thanked her and rubbed her stomach. I stood there, wondering if she had any more jam to give me. "I haven't made any recently," she said in answer to my brisk question, "but maybe soon." I was annoyed, but resigned. My mother was just happy I was finally starting to act like a normal kid who ate and talked. So what if all I ate was jam, she thought. At least I was eating. A few more weeks passed and we ran out of jam. The grocery store no longer stocked it, so Mother and I made a visit to Mrs. Willison. When she answered the door, I noticed her stomach wasn't round anymore, and she once again looked sad. She invited us inside, the offer of jam having me run into the house before my mother had a chance to reply. I sat patiently at her round kitchen table while she spread jam onto slices of bread. My mother watched in earnest as I looked at the bread suspiciously before picking it up and nibbling it. To my relief, the sweet and savory taste of the jam overpowered the bread taste, and I greedily ate it down. My mother sagged in relief, seeing this as another victory in the battle of my eating habits. I ate several more pieces of bread with jam, while Mrs. Willison and Mother talked. I ignored their conversation in favor of eating my treat, occasionally catching words like stillborn and devastated, but paying no mind. Before we left, my mother hugged Mrs. Willison tightly. She didn't have any jam to give me that day, but promised me some soon. I left with a full belly in the anticipation of more of my sweet treats soon. For years, this pattern went on. Mother and Mrs. Willison developed a sort of friendship, and when we would go to visit every few months, they would sit at Mrs. Willison's table and talk while I ate jam. Eventually, Mother began putting the jam on other foods to see if I would eat them. I tried chicken, beef, bananas, and apples, all smothered in my delicious jam, and ate every bite. Mother and Father practically sobbed in relief. By the time I was 12, I was eating more foods, but still relied heavily on the jam. If it didn't have jam liberally coating it, then I wouldn't try it. That jam seemed to mask every other flavor, and I used it like other people used ketchup or gravy. In this time, Mrs. Willison seemed to age quickly, and her production of the jam slowed. She told me and Mother that it was hard on her body making the jam. It was a long process and very labor-intensive. I worried about the day when she might no longer make it for me, but she simply patted my head and told me that she'd make it as long as I wanted it. I smiled. By the time I was 18, I was better with food, but still hated the taste and texture of it. Mrs. Willison's jam was the first and only food I've ever actually liked or wanted to eat of my own accord, and she still supplied me with it. Her frequencies of batches lessened to only once a year or more, but when I finally got those jars of rich, red goodness, I was thrilled. After high school was over, I moved away for college, but every time I returned home, I made sure to stop in and visit Miss Willison. She seemed to grow lonely as she aged, and I often wondered where her husband was, or if she even had one. When asked what she did for work, she just said she was in the business of making people happy. I wasn't sure what that meant, but I figured it was something to do with her amazing jam. During my visits, we'd talk and catch up, and she would always send me home with jars of jam. I rationed those out back at university, where I was old enough to know that I needed to eat, but still stubborn enough to hate food besides the jam. More years passed. Despite my unusual tendencies as a child, I grew into a rather successful and normal man. I work in data entry, which is as boring as it sounds, and I'm married to a wonderful woman who, at first, was annoyed with my weird habit, but came to accept that I just don't like the stuff. Doesn't matter what it is, I just don't like food. I have never, and likely will never, eat food for the joy of it, unless we count jam, of course. My wife doesn't like it, but she's used to it now, I think. A few weeks ago, we returned home to visit my parents. As I've been doing for years, I made a point to visit Mrs. Willison. She's older now, and time has been unkind to her. Her body seems frail, as if it has carried heavy burdens for years, and she no longer stands up straight. But she still smiled when she saw me, and smiled even wider when she met my wife. We had a nice visit, her getting to know my wife, and catching up on what had been happening in my life. Just before I left, she gave me a box of jam. "I'm afraid this is it, Mark dear." Her voice sounded as frail as her body looked, and for the first time, the idea that I could lose Mrs. Willison popped into my head. Even though she was only in her 50s. She seemed much older. She'd been a part of my life for so long now. I couldn't imagine no longer being able to see her. "I'm too old for making jam now," she said with a sigh. "My body, it just won't allow it. These things happen. Best to leave it to the young ones." She smiled weakly, but I could tell she was sad. Tears pricked my eyes as I set the box of jam jars on the ground and wrapped her frail body in a tight hug. "Thank you for sharing your jam with me for as long as you have," I said. Then I kissed her forehead gently. Mrs. Willison smiled and waved me and my wife off as we left. That was a few weeks ago. Today, I got a call from my mother. She was sobbing uncontrollably. It took me a long time to finally figure out what she was saying. And when I did, hell, I didn't know what to think. I sat there at my kitchen table, still in my pajamas, and with a plate of jam toast in front of me, while my mother told me Mrs. Wilson had passed away. I sat there at my kitchen table, still in my pajamas, and with a plate of jam toast in front of me, while my mother told me Mrs. Willison had passed away. It appeared she had died several days ago, but no one knew until my mother went for her weekly visit and found the other woman slumped over in her chair. There was nothing they could do. I stared at my jam toast and felt numb. "But that's not the worst of it, Mark," my mother sobbed. "What?" I asked. "What, Mom?" "Oh God, Mark, what they found. God, I'm so sorry." She broke down into incoherent sobbing again. Eventually, my father took the phone from her and explained what the police had found in Mrs. Wilson's house when they arrived. I'm still not sure what to think of it. "Son, I hope you're sitting down for this," my father began. No one knew what a crazy, sick bitch she was, I swear." He cleared his throat and sounded like he was fighting back his own tears. "I'm just sorry we fed you that shit for so long." My eyes immediately went to the jam, my precious jam. The police searched her house. In the cellar, they found the area where she made her jam. Jesus, son. It was kids. God damn it, it was kids, her own babies. Turns out, Mrs. Willison's jam was homemade in a very literal sense. She had, a year before I first ever tried her jam, gotten pregnant and then miscarried at home. Apparently, it caused some sort of mental break in her brain, and for God knows what reason, she decided to incorporate the baby fetus, whatever, into her jam. She cooked it with the berries, strained it, and took care to make sure not to have any fragments in the final product. That's why it was always so perfectly clear and free of seeds. It was also why it took so long for her to make her batches. After that first one, she decided to try again with both the pregnancies, and when that too ended in a second trimester miscarriage, the jam. For over 20 years, Mrs. Willison lived in a cycle of getting herself pregnant, which she apparently achieved by acting as a prostitute in the larger neighboring town, and then aborting the pregnancies at home sometime between the 12th and 20th week when the ingredient was large enough to be made into a batch. That was why she only made one batch of jam a year, and why she appeared to age so quickly and harshly. Back-to-back pregnancies will do that to a woman. In the end, When she said her body could no longer support jam making, she was telling the truth. Women in their 50s don't often get pregnant, and Mrs. Willison was no exception to that rule. My parents were horrified. For years they had been feeding me this stuff. For years they had been gleefully shoving this jam into my system, ignorant of the fact that it was made with human remains. They had been so thrilled when I had started eating normal food, so thrilled when 6-year-old me had pointed to that jar of jam and then taken it so eagerly. My mother apologized profusely on the phone through her sobs. When the call ended, I looked down at the plate of jam toast in front of me, studying the deep red spread with its flawlessly smooth consistency, in the sweet and savory combination of it that had been the only food I ever actually enjoyed in my life. Silently, I rose from my chair and went to the cellar where I stored my box of jams. Mrs. Willison made 12 jars out of each batch, and I had learned to stretch that very carefully over the years. I still had 11 remaining. Carefully, I looked through the box, taking out each and every jar and inspecting it, as if trying to see the tiny particles of unborn children that had been cooked into each one. At the very bottom of the box, I found an envelope. I reached for it with a shaky hand and pulled out a letter from Mrs. Willison. It was short, not saying much, but I smiled to read it all the same. I've always had issues with food. I don't know why. Most children grow out of their picky eating, and to some extent I did too. I learned over time that I need food to live, though eating it brings me no joy and often makes me sick if I find a texture or taste I can't stand. Mrs. Willison's jam saved me. It had been the first and only food I had ever liked, and the only one I willingly and gladly ate. And in that envelope that I found at the bottom of my last box of jars, the last batch Mrs. Willison made, I found her legacy to me. Something she wanted me to have before she died, because, she said, I was the bright spot of her life, and she had done this all for me. The sound of my wife moving around upstairs managed to reach me in the basement. She's awake late because she's had a difficult time sleeping lately. Whistling to myself, I put the index card back into the envelope and leave my box of jam in the same place as before. Then I climb the stairs to the kitchen, where I find my wife standing at the stove, scrambling eggs. She turns to me and smiles, her hair tousled from deep sleep, and her face serene, not yet twisted up in agony due to her morning sickness. She turns and kisses me, and I feel the soft swell of her pregnant stomach against my body. Our last trip home had been to surprise my parents with the pregnancy. She's 12 weeks now, so she says it's safe to tell people the news. Of course my parents were thrilled. So was Mrs. Willison, which is why I think she left me the recipe. I think if I push her hard enough, I might be able to get my wife to make some jam for me.